Welcome, fellow wizards, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today, we're going to be speaking with Jacob Clayman of Kongregate and talking all about the culture of indie games.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
In our live magical podcast, we give devs the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly asking them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is a mostly unedited recording of a weekly event we host on our Discord on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So feel free to swing by for the next one and ask your questions live. Today, I'm your guest host, Rick Williams. You may recognize me as a regular attendee of this podcast. Willem is currently at the Game Developers Conference over in San Francisco, so I am guest hosting for the day. Jacob, what are you having for lunch today?
Uh, Typically for lunch, I have a Soylent protein shake. They're only 400 calories. It's my secret to keeping in shape. Everyone always asks me, "Oh, how you do it? You're in the game industry. You're so talented and you're so fit and healthy." And it's Soylent shakes. Sorry, this isn't branded. I'm just kind of riffing. Um, But yeah, so you want me to talk about my origin story,
I'd
how I
like
got it.
I just want to comment really quick because you mentioned that people say, hey, you stay fit and you're eating well. A lot of times people don't think about this, but developer work is so mentally taxing that a lot of developers really enjoy keeping themselves physically fit so that their bodies are in a state to support their mind. It helps us focus and be more creative with our problem solving just by getting that exercise and being able to stay healthy.
That's true. I mean, a lot of people's journey of self-improvement ties directly to their career aspirations. And I think that fitness is like a really big part of self-improvement. It's hard to really commit yourself to learning new skills and meeting new people and becoming your best self while ignoring that side of things. Because it also, I mean, it gives you the confidence you need when you're meeting new people, when you're going into interviews to project yourself, to project like you're the best version of yourself. Fitness, I think, does go a long way to that. And yeah, just the day to day, like keeping yourself, energetic and able to put towards the mental energy on your problems.
So let's jump into the meat of this. So the format of this podcast is generally you'll explain your origin story. How did you get into the games industry for the first 15 minutes? Then there will be another 15 minutes where we chat about the topic that you want to talk about. In this case, the culture of indie games. And then at the end of this, we will do 20 minutes of question and answer. So if you wouldn't mind, share with us, how did you get into games?
Sure. So um, I was in college and I was somewhat aimless, but I grew up playing with mods, making mods for games, uh, doing level design here and there. And in my second year of college, I went to community college, Montgomery College. I saw a program with University of Baltimore for game design, engineering, digital simulation. It was a bachelor's degree program for basically game development. And I was like, well, this really speaks to me. And I had a really clear transition into that. So that was really like the formal beginning of my journey into the game industry was getting my degree in game design. In the last couple years of my degree, luckily I'm local to Maryland. I lived in Maryland my whole life, so I was local to ZeniMax, or as most people know, Bethesda Softworks or Bethesda Game Studios. I lived right nearby them, um, and I saw that they were hiring for QA testers, and this was 13 years ago, when the advice when you would like apply by sending in emails as well as going through the website, and that type of stuff worked. So someone was like, "Oh, just send an email once a week or once a month with your application." I don't know if that helped or not, but eventually they got back to me and like, "Oh, would you like to come in for an interview?" And I was jumping for joy. I was like, "Oh my God, Bethesda Softworks, they want to interview me, QA tester." And I went in, um, and they picked me up and they gave me a job. It was like a summer internship between semesters. The first game I ever worked on with them, the first game was Brink, and I really liked it. But most of that first summer was spent working on Skyrim, and that was in 2011. So that was right before the release. Uh, that was really great experience for me. I kept coming back for more stints with Bethesda Softworks over the course of like 4 years. Probably had um, like 2 to 3 years worth of contracts with them while I was going to school and getting my degree, and eventually graduated and went back to be a QA tester. And the thing about working at Bethesda is that the QA department is technically part of the publishing studio, and so it's a different entity than the team that like makes. Even though like we were testing Skyrim, it's technically like under a different corporate umbrella. And the process for like joining the developer team was essentially once every 4 years, they would open the doors to the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, bring in 4 kids with a golden ticket, then one person would get the role if it was like a level design internship or working with the art team. But you would be working directly with the developers. It would be an internship on the development team. So I interviewed with them. I got the interview. I was talking to the producer, and the guy was like, "Man, your work is so good. You've got this portfolio from your personal work and from college, and you paid your dues in the QA department, and you've got such an advantage over the rest of the applicants. I'm excited to introduce you to the rest of the team." And I was so stoked. I was like, "This is it. This is my chance." So, anyways, they ended up hiring someone else. And then the best advice I got from one of my coworkers was that, if you really want to move up, then you have to move on. Because the only other opportunity for me at that company was to continue in QA, go into QA leadership, go into QA management, maybe go into production and join the game team eventually. But I was already making games at that point. I was already on the side. I was making indie games. I was engineering. And that's what I wanted to do with my career. It's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be paid to make indie games. And this isn't a knock on quality assurance. I love my time in QA and I love everyone in that department. But um, that's not what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I can definitely see how while it would be fun for a period of time to be doing all of the testing, when we get into game development, like ultimately I do think a lot of us really crave that creative process of actually building out the games and designing the mechanics.
Right. Um, yeah, if you're lucky, you get more direct contact with the developers if you're integrated QA. But like I said, at Bethesda, it's kind of a separate entity, so all you did was the testing and reporting. Um, anyways, I realize I've been talking for a little bit longer than we normally do this story, but so I was working with the IGDA, which is International Game Developers Association. It was actually a handful of guys from the DC chapter, and we were making an indie game about trains with guns on them in the Wild West. And we'd been working on that for like 3 years by this point. By the point that I was looking to leave QA, and we were so close to getting it done, but it would have required me working on it full time. And so that's what I did. I said to Bethesda, "Thank you, for the opportunities, but we're going to part ways." And I worked. I was privileged enough to be able to work on my indie full time for the next about a year after that. And so a year after that of working on it full time, we released the game on Steam. We sold about 5,000 copies. Today, you can still find it. It's called Tumbleweed Express. It's on Steam. It has very positive reviews. I think we sell it for like $4 or $5, and it often goes on sale. Um, but then, I took that. It became a cornerstone of my professional portfolio. I started applying. I started working my network. By that time, we'd been showing our game at MagFest and other areas, and so I knew people in the industry from MagFest, and I leveraged some of those connections. One of the guys who was running MagFest at the time, the Indie Game Showcase, his name is Tronster. He works at Firaxis. I went out to lunch with him, and I was like, "Hey, man, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I've been working on. Do you know of any opportunities?" He knew a guy at a company called Amtote north of Baltimore, and they were looking for Unity game engineers to help build their slot machines. Um, and I was like, awesome. So I got the reference, I got the interview, I got the job, and then I was working for them for about 3 years as an engineer. Slot machines aren't one to one with traditional game development, but as far as like the work goes and the team structure goes, it's essentially a game studio. And then I transitioned from being an engineer into like product management, product ownership. One of my coworkers, who's been in the industry for a while, he left to go work at Kongregate, and then he put in a good word for me, and they picked me up at Kongregate. That was in April 2022. And then in the beginning of 2023, I was put in charge of the game Animation Throwdown, which is anim- the 20th Century Fox animated property leveraged collectible card game. It's on mobile, it's on web, it's on Steam. So I've been managing that project, and by managing, I mean my official title is like product owner, product manager. But in the way that most people understand, my role is basically that of game director. So I've been like directing that project and responsible for it for the last like year and a half.
Wow, that sounds kind of like the dream job. So, what do you do? Are you like the producer? Are you the lead game designer? Are you a project manager? What exactly do you do in that role?
Essentially, yes to all of those. Approvals for art, for design, for live ops, they go through me. I'm kind of the final say. I'm often writing game design documents, working on our live ops roadmap, planning out, 6 weeks, 3 months, 5 years, what the project should look like. I'm responsible for the vision of the project. I'm responsible for making sure there's enough work, that valuable work for all the different disciplines on the team to be tackling uh, every single 2 week cycle. I have on my team a producer who helps a lot with the delegation and the organizing, and the project management side of things. But we kind of work hand in hand to make sure that everything is going smoothly. That uh, person who's working on feature A lines up with feature B. That they will make sense when they come out at the same time. They won't step on each other's toes. There's a lot that goes into it. I end up wearing many hats on a day-to-day basis.
That's cool. Is there anything that you specifically do not do? Like something that you just know that it's much better off handled by the other people on the team?
As often as possible, I try to delegate art direction, and particular with a game like this, it comes down to like UI UX design. That's definitely, as an indie developer, like that's also my weakest aspect. Although I've made games like start to finish entirely myself. Um, I've got a game on Steam called like Don't Push Me, where the art is like cubes and triangles. So I recognize that that's like my weakest area, and I lean heavily on our art team and our art direction as much as possible.
Yeah, as you do more and more projects, and as your projects get bigger and bigger, you really start to learn to rely on these people who have really amazing skill sets and they're just way better at any one thing than you could ever personally be.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of diverse experience and lots of different roles. And a good number of achievements under your belt. You have a pretty impressive resume. I'm curious, do you have any dream projects that you would like to grow into going forward?
Yeah, it's a lot. I'm proud of how far I've come. I've always got, more plans ahead of me. The dream for me, as it was years ago, is still to work on something very big with lots of people that you play with a controller on your Nintendo or your PlayStation or your Xbox on your TV. Eventually those are like the types of projects that I'd like to have a stake in, like a leadership role in.
So something like a Call of Duty?
Not necessarily called right, yeah. I like Call of Duty. If someone offered me, more money than I'm making now to work on Call of Duty, I'd say yes.
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating story about how you got started, how, you just started studying in school and then got some jobs and eventually worked your way up to better and better roles because of the experience you gained over time. So let's move on. Let's talk about the topic for that you're here to talk about today. Tell us about indie game culture and how you got into it and what you have to say on the matter.
Yeah, so ingraining myself in indie game culture, I would say started with our first trip to MagFest as a team, which I think was 2013. And me and the guys, we submitted our game to judging. This was one of the early years that MagFest was running the video game showcase. It's abbreviated to MIVS. And I remember there was a handful of other games in the convention hall with us. A couple of them stood out, but that was a really good as a team of indie developers for a lot of reasons. Most of them are related to networking. We met a lot of other indie developers at that time, and we got to share war stories, tips and tricks, um, keep in touch with them afterwards. The people running the showcase, like I said, Tronster was a very big figure in my personal story. I never would have met him had I not brought my game to MagFest. I wouldn't have gotten the job that let me start getting paid to be an engineer and eventually like a game manager. And then interactions with the community were really incredibly valuable. I can't understate it. One of my tips for game design in general is that you don't know if your ideas are good until the controller's in someone's hand, until you're watching somebody play your game. It doesn't really matter how good you think your ideas are or how many ideas you have until you built it and put it in front of someone else. It hasn't been tested. And there's no better test than bringing your game to a showcase as 20,000 people go in and out of the convention hall and tell you everything that that they like about it, what they don't like about it. Most of the best feedback that you'll get from watching players is unspoken, so you take tons and tons of notes. Um, but yeah, that was basically my induction into indie game culture. And then moving on from that, just to expand, I think we came back 2 years later when we went to other showcases. But after we released our game, I was so enamored with the showcase scene, the indie showcase scene. The people running it were so wholesome and nice, and all the other developers were so cool and learning about their stories that it really made me want to come back and pay it forward. So the very next year after we released our game, I volunteered at MagFest, and I've been going every year since. I was a volunteer, and now I'm like senior staff, helping run the showcase, and I come back every year to do that.
Yeah, I was actually a developer that was showing at MagFest back in 2022. What you're saying about getting people in front of your game and playing and the value in seeing them enjoying it and getting the playtest feedback is incredible. Like I can't overstate enough just how valuable that was to our team. We were able to get tons of first time user experience playtests. We were able to get a very diverse set of people playing the game. It really helped us hone in on who the target market for our game was and who to build it for. And just the camaraderie, being around all of the other developers, seeing the games that are going on, you really feel like you're taking the game to the next level at an event like Magfest. I want to thank you for putting on events like that because they are such a valuable resource to developers. It is an absolute must-have experience as a developer, especially if your intention is to actually go commercial with your project and where it will be received by people outside of your team.
Yeah, it's an incredibly wholesome experience. It fills my soul. It filled my soul as a developer. It fills my soul as a volunteer. Uh, People have trouble seeing the value in the work that they're doing, and seeing the value in themselves. And once you're there, once you get through the judging process, once you've psyched yourself up enough to submit your game and get it judged and drive and buy, get your hotel room and show up and build your booth, people are showing up. They're playing your game. There's smiles on their faces. Other developers are coming over to your table. They're telling you what they think is cool. All this positive feedback you would never have been exposed to is really necessary for a lot of developers to give them that push to releasing their game. There's two bottlenecks to indie game development. The first is starting, and the second is finishing. Um, and I've seen a lot of indie developers come to MagFest year after year. Their game gets a little bit better, a little bit better. And I'd like to think that that process of showcasing gives them the feedback and the motivation and the energy to release their projects. And I know that that was true with us on our game Tumbleweed.
So if somebody did have a project that they thought would be cool to show at an event like this, how do they find out about this kind of an event, and how do they know that they're ready?
So outreach is one of our weakest areas for the MagFest Indie Showcase. I will say that it is an entirely volunteer workforce that runs the showcase, and none of us are career marketers. So we kind of do our best with outreach. We post on our socials. We leverage the MagFest social, and other than that, it's kind of word of mouth. People who have come to the showcase as attendees or developers tend to spread the word. So that's typically how people hear about it is they've been to MagFest or they know someone who's been to MagFest. And then in terms of getting ready and knowing you're ready, um, if that's a question you have to ask yourself, then my advice is to look at our history of alumni and any other local showcase you've been to. The games that we've had are an indication of the games that get accepted. I guess that's tautological, but you know, if you're wondering like what a showcase ready game looks like, then just look at the games that I think you should always submit your game for judging. You shouldn't be the person to tell yourself no. That's a big part of our internal conversations of like how do we get more people like feeling confident to submit. And I think we do our best, but at the end of the day, I think that has to come from inside. And if you get rejected, uh, it doesn't mean that your game wasn't ready. It just means that there were other games more ready than you that filled up all the slots because we do have a limited number of booths that we give away every year.
Yeah, I know that every time the Magfest applications open, the developer discords for our local region just light up. Everybody's posting and sharing that, hey, applications are open. So I'm curious if you've ever attended a convention like that. The all of the games, like you can tell that like some games are wildly different from one another. Like they've some games are very good in one aspect, but they're like perhaps not good on their art, but the gameplay is really awesome. What does the judging process look like that that determines the criteria for whether a game gets in or not?
So um, we try to keep the secret sauce of our judging close to the chest, um, and that's probably because it changes every year. We're constantly iterating on our process. It's a mix of, what the bar for quality is, and uh, on the bottom end, and then on the top end, like what counts as indie. So we try to keep people within that range of like indie, like below double, or below double or triple A or whatever, and above like student student project. And I don't want to demean student projects, because there are student projects that have gone on to become blockbusters, but on average, you know. Um, and then I'm probably one of our more forgiving judges, or a more generous judge with my scoring, especially if a game, we'll take games that have already been released, for example. And so if there's a game that somebody submits and it's like on Steam and it has positive reviews, so people in the wild have already decided that your project is spending money on and reviewing highly, then I kind of take that as a sign that it's ready for a showcase. Because who am I? Like at that point, I don't, you don't need my personal like um, grades to say you're worthy of being in a showcase. So I tend to like give games I'm in that case, even if it's not my personal cup of tea. Um, what it boils down to is the direction that we try to give our judges, because it's not only internal judges, we have volunteer judges, but the guidance that we try to give our judges is essentially like, do you think that this is a game that other people would enjoy playing MagFest? And whatever that is out of 10 is the score that you give. And we do that to try to eliminate like personal biases and personal um, preferences. Because sometimes, I mean, every so often we'll get a judge who's like, "Well, I hate shooter games, so I'm going to rate every shooter game low." We try to account for that, and remove those like outlier scores, one way or the other. But that's just, I think that's the type of insight I can give into our judging process.
This has all been really cool and great information. So we're getting ready to move on to community questions. If anybody in the audience has a question for Jacob, just go ahead and type your questions in the chat, mark them with the Q emoji, and we'll get them to you. Jacob, do you have any final notes that you want to mention about indie game culture?
So the indie developer culture is all about relationships, and networking. At least where you and I live, there's two major chapters for the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA. There's a Baltimore chapter and a DC chapter. Whether you're working on a game or not, or you graduated, or you're still a student, or you just dream of making games one day, but you work at the bank, you should come to the IGDA. You should come to those meetings. Um, that's where you're going to meet people in the industry. That's where you're going to meet other people who are making indie games, people who release their indie games, people who are looking for talent to start their project, or have an area of weakness in a project that they're already working on and they fill out their team. Those are the people who you want to meet. They're going to support you in your personal goals. They're going to support you in your career. They're your people, and they come together in these clubs, in these IGDA meetings, other indie game or game industry meetings all over the country. Um, the people who go to the showcases, the people who run the showcases. In the area, it's not just IGDA or MagFest. There's also Gamescape. There's also the IGDA District Arcade. If you go up and down the East Coast, you've got PAX East, you've got Too Many Games, you've got Boston Festival of Indie Games. That's really where you'll get into the indie game culture, is by showing up and shaking hands.
Yeah, I think I first started attending the IGDA meetings in 2015 or 2016. And I remember, not really being sure that I was ready to show up, but I just decided to go anyway, and everybody was really friendly. Because I think all of us know what it's like to have been that newbie, that first person who showed up. So we try to be friendly to one another.
Yeah, it's a club that's open to everyone. All you have to do is show up. And I know that that is a big step for a lot of people. And I'll tell you the advice that I give to students when I'm talking to them is that every time I've out of my comfort zone, my life has gotten better. So put yourself out there, meet new people, make new friends. uh, Especially in an industry like this, a lot of it is who you know. I've worked very hard in my career to be lucky enough to meet people who have propelled me forwards with job opportunities and references. Um, I have the portfolio, I have the resume, but that none of that would have meant anything if I didn't know someone, if there wasn't someone to give me that hand up. And that's part of why I volunteer, is because of how challenging it was for me and how much I want to pay it forward and be that resource to the next generation of people who come after me. Because I think it's only getting,
Yeah, some of us definitely want to lay the groundwork for people to come
yeah.
behind us.
Well, I think because I'm going to say I think it's only getting harder. I think whatever it was when I was coming up, getting a job in QA and then getting a local engineering role. Uh, there's been more layoffs in the last year in the game industry than I've ever seen before. It's hard to say how much that impacts entry level hiring. Uh, Across the board. It feels like most people have been impacted have been like mid levels, mid or associate levels. But still, I imagine it's even harder now to get your foot in the door than it was when I started.
Yeah, the whole situation is very unfortunate for everybody who was receiving their primary income from their game development job, especially in the AAA studios. But one of the things that I have noticed is because there have been people who have been let go from their corporate jobs, they're now starting to go into hyper networking mode and they're getting to know people and they're starting to bleed into the indie communities. And so we're getting some really interesting people who want to come in and collaborate with us who have a lot of experience in making those AAA titles. In a lot of ways, the hemorrhaging of the talent from those high budget studios might be the instigator of a genesis of a bunch of new, really great indie studios.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a secret. It's funny, but a lot of professionals in the game industry who work at the biggest studios, who've been working them there in their entire careers, they fantasize about throwing it all behind and making their own indie game and leading their own team of individuals. I remember in one of my early IGDA meetings, I was showing off Tumbleweed Express. There were two uh, developers from Bethesda who were showing up like the princess Jasmine hiding in the marketplace because they were so excited to see what it's like on the outside, what life is like on the outside, what all the cool stuff that people are working on, how much they wish, they would be like, oh, we wish we could kind of just make a do go it on our own and make it ourselves. And so it's a little bit of that grass is always greener, but just to put the idea out there that it's not as intimidating as you think it is meeting these people because they're really excited about the work that you're doing too. They're just as excited about your work as you are about theirs.
All right, so let's move on to our community questions. The first question is going to be from Petunio, and he does not currently have a mic, so I'm going to ask it on his behalf. Petunio's question for you is, what is the biggest change you've seen in the industry since you started?
That's a great question. Um, it's definitely, it plays right to the topic of indie game culture, what the definition of indie is, because we've really gone through a renaissance of indie games. We're in a golden age. And when I was in college, me and my friend, we went to Indie Game the movie, and that was the documentary where they
Oh yeah,
followed,
Super Meat Boy.
yeah, Super Meat Ed McMullen. and his partner for Super Meat Boy, Jonathan Blow from Braid, and um, Bill Fish from Fez. And they made a documentary about their projects and how unique and crazy it was that these projects had kind of blown up and been so successful. And nowadays it happens once a month. Once a month, there's a breakout indie title that kind of takes the world by storm, sells a million copies. There's a lot of reasons for this. The tools for making games have never been better or more robust. The educational resources are really fleshed out. ChatGPT is on the scene now, and people who don't have a traditional computer science background are finding it easier and easier to produce working code that creates the types of features they're trying to build and prototype. Um, for at least maybe not in the last couple years, but like leading up to COVID, there was a real taste from investors to put money into indie games. So a lot of developers left their AAA studios, like I said, to make it on their own. They use their connections, they use their leverage and their clout to fund and start their own studios and get lots of funding. So you saw tons of pop-up studios grabbing up talent that were technically indie, but had lots of backing financially and talent from their position in the industry, and they were releasing massive games or massively successful but still small in scope indie games. And I say that would be kind of the biggest change that I've seen over my career. It's just like the proliferation of talent uh, and financial success of the indie games. And you look on Steam, I open Steam, whether there's a sale or not, and I go through my feed, and there are so many. There's more games that are worth playing that you could ever play in one lifetime. And that wasn't the case 11 years ago. It wasn't the case 13 years ago when I got started. But now there's so many games I see that look better than anything I've ever made. That obviously have so much passion and love put into them, and I see them on Steam, and they have like 50 reviews, and you can feel that like behind the scenes they might be struggling to get the sales and get their name out there because there's so much competition and there's so much quality.
Yeah, I think nowadays there's something like 60 Steam games that are released every single day. It can be very overwhelming because how do you even get noticed in that massive sea of titles? So you can build the best game in the world, but unless you have on-point marketing, you may not even get noticed. And this is like assuming you built a really fantastic game. A lot of times when you're first getting started, like you're not even sure that you're making a project that you think people are even going to like. It definitely goes back to, getting out into in-person events and conventions where you can put the title in front of people, get them to know you personally, but it really is a tough world out there. It's exciting, but also pretty intimidating.
Yeah, and I want to tie that back into what we were talking about a little bit earlier of like how do you know you're ready? How do you decide to put yourself out there? If you're judging your personal quality and your personal like definitions of success based on the games that you see releasing on Steam every day or the games that get hyped up on Twitter or social media, you'll never be good enough. You'll never feel like you're good enough. And it's really easy to get down on yourself. There's this meme that I love where the person is like, "Oh, I saw someone online today that was younger than me and more talented, and it just ruined my whole day." You kind of have to get past that because it's going to happen every single day. And so the way to combat that is to go with your game in person. It's to go to meetups, it's to go to showcases, it's to hit that grassroots local community. Because when you're showing these games in person, you're going to win every single time. You're going to get valuable feedback, you're going to get you're going to get a personal connection every single time that you show your game in person. And that type of experience is more and more rare to come by online because there's so much noise online that's hard to break through.
Yeah, the in-person events are definitely a great chance to build that personal connection with the people who are going to be playing your game and be fans of it. I do want to get talk on that part about when you see somebody who's doing something really cool. I remember I used to get like really like, oh man, how can I compete with somebody who's doing something this cool? But as I've done more and more projects and worked with different people, I started to think, oh wow, whenever you see somebody doing something cool, like how can I work with them? How can I collaborate with them and like build something together?
Yeah, yeah. When you see someone do, just as a general life tip, like if you see someone doing something that you don't know how they did it, ask them how they did it so that you can absorb their power and become stronger.
Yeah, one thing about us nerds is whenever we do something that we're really proud of, we like to talk about how we did it because
Yeah.
if somebody understands it, we will share. So I'm going to move on to the next community question. This question is asked by Alan, and he also does not currently have a mic. So his question is, based on your experience, what's the most stable role in the industry?
So my answer to that is kind of boring, maybe expected. It's engineering. It typically engineers um, have the most experience or have the most job security at any company. Um, there's a couple of reasons for that. Historically, engineering has been less accessible, so there's been less competition. Nowadays, there's more competition for engineering roles than there's ever been. But for senior architects who don't know how to build a game, who know how to make a game, they're still going to be some of the most valuable, well-paid people on any team, and they're going to have a lot of job security. That said, a bunch of really talented engineers from my company just got laid off late last, a couple months ago and late last year. Um, Not because they weren't good at what they do, not even necessarily because they were redundant, but just because corporate pressure comes down on a team at the end of the day. And so this is kind of like another, I wouldn't even call it a piece of advice, but since you asked for my personal experience, the other key to job security is to not be the most well-paid person on your team. Um, you should always try to be. You should always get your worth, argue for yourself, negotiate as much as possible. Um, Money is pretty abstract. You're all worth $1 million salary, in my opinion. I'm, I'm very socialist in that way. But when corporate pressure comes down on your team and they need to make cuts, they typically start with the people who are being paid the most. It's unfortunate.
I guess in some ways that does make sense because if you get a really skilled software architect who can properly train a team of engineers, once the basic architecture is created, you and everybody knows how to safely work within that framework, they could just endlessly maintain the code.
I mean, that's going to vary at any time. Don't underestimate a company's ability to completely shoot itself in the foot and come out unprepared at the other side of layoffs because they got rid of someone who is vital to production or live ops. It happens all the time. Because sometimes the pressure is just more. It's more than, it's a short term for a lot of companies. It's the name of the game is short term survival. So even if they know they're shooting themselves in the foot, they'll still pull the trigger.
Yeah, I think that's one of the motivations for a lot of the people who want to be indie because not for the creative agency alone, but because they just have that entrepreneurial spirit. And in some ways, they don't like the idea that there are corporate bean counters somewhere who just decide whether or not you have a job from month to month.
If you're truly indie, you'll coast. You won't be affected that way. But yeah, if you're dealing with a publisher, which you want to be, I mean, that's like not everyone wants that, but that's like the win. I call that like the win condition of many indie game studios is getting published and getting picked up. But then, the flip side of that is you become dependent on them, and then yeah, and at that point, their corporate structure can make or break your process and your flow.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next community question that is from Soldier 314. Soldier does not have a mic as well and is going to have me read this question. What skills should you have that would stand out from other applicants when looking for an entry-level QA job?
Entry QA, the bar. I'm trying to find a nice way to say the bar is very low. So this the skills that stand out are entirely social skills. And and that actually that'll stick with you almost all the way to the not that I'm at the top or a top, but at the end of the day, like people want to work with someone who they're friendly with, who they can get along with. That's more important, and it's more important as the skill base of the applicants get better every year. Um, you're competing with more and more people every year who have the same skills as you, who have access to the same tools as you, who have been working and have ChatGPT, and have the same degree as you. And you're also, now that you're competing, now that a lot of places are hiring remote, you're competing with people all over the country. You're competing with people with people in other countries. So with all that in mind, the best skills that you can have to succeed are going to be your social skills, because the team has to be able to work together on a day-to-day basis. They have to be able to communicate in person, on video chat or on in text without getting on each other's nerves, without misinterpreting directions, without getting frustrated, without being rude. Um, that's who I mean. Imagine the type of people who you with, and be that type of person. You know, look, pitch to pitch to mentors, because people love to teach. They love to pass on their knowledge, and pitch to be a mentor because people want to be able to learn from you.
Yeah, the soft skills is something that a lot of devs don't really think about when they're first getting started, but once you move out of your tutorial silo and start working with others, you start to realize how important the soft skills really are in team communication. When there's a disagreement with something that needs to have or a miscommunication, being able to work through that's important. And if you run into somebody or ever work with someone who's a tough personality, then you end up coming away from those conversations not feeling very good. And when you have people who have attacked you or otherwise made the situation uncomfortable, you end up getting into the fight or flight mode. And that, and because game dev requires being creative, like you can't really work with people who constantly put you in that fight or flight mode. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This question comes from Misha. I'm going to bring Misha on to ask his question.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, just kind of about me. I was last year laid off from an actual like an animation studio after my contract ended. Because it was just kind of a semi-entry level role doing what they call shot finaling. But of course, a lot of my other previous smaller experiences in games were both in like technical art and 3D modeling and on smaller projects. But like I've also now been, as I'm trying to find new positions that are relevant and to certain studios, and because it's more of I was working with like a company that does like stylized animation for kids, but even though I want to position myself as a 3D artist, even though I didn't do 3D art with them, how can I still showcase my skills without it being misinterpreted? Because there are times where I can't help but feel like, even if I try to convert the transferable skills, right? And then the other thing too is I have a part-time job at a grocery store that I've held on to for 5 years, like where I'm usually only there like 2 or 3 times a week. And in doing so, it's been, I'm happy they kept me, but it's like, if your guys are talking about those social skills, how can I transfer those onto their old resume as well, when typically employers rather just filter out the relevant skills from, industry jobs.
Um, Sure. So I'm trying to like extract the essence of your question. Um, at face value, you ask how do you apply without it being like interpreted wrong.
Yeah.
I'll say that like it's the process isn't that personal at that stage of applications. People, teams, hiring managers, they put up job postings because there's a problem on their team that they're not able to solve with the resources they have. And so
Hmm.
your role as an applicant is to be the solution to their problem. And that's what your resume is supposed to reflect.
Right.
So if you're applying to like a particular role, what you do is you pull out uh, they'll post a list of like job responsibilities that
Yeah.
patients they have for people in that role. You just reword them onto your resume into the jobs that you've held before, just to say that yeah, I did that. Where and when I worked for this company, I did all the things an applicant to do. I won't say that you should
Right.
have like a personal resume for every single company that you apply to, but you should have like at
Hmm.
least a for every discipline or type of role, and it should be
Yeah.
filled with bullet
No, for
points
sure.
that mimic the job requirements of the postings. And that's like I think that's the best way to like break through the recruiting process. That being
Yeah.
said, the best opportunity you'll ever have to get an interview at a studio is by already knowing someone that's there. Um,
Yeah.
that's a big studio. You'll have to go to GDC. If
Hmm.
it's a local studio, I'm lucky. I live local to a bunch of game studios, and they just show
Yeah.
up. They just show up like people. I mean, Firax Tronster hosts. Tronster is has a senior leadership position at Firaxis, and he runs the IGDA Baltimore chapter, and he hosts
Hmm.
meetings at the company headquarters itself at the end of the year. So that's kind of those are the two sides of my advice.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that is actually what I have done in the past too. It's just, even when I do throw in those things and, try to create a cover letter a little bit, which also I'm not always sure if it's relevant considering sometimes, as like I say, even as a 3D artist, it feels more like it's better to just polish my 3D portfolio to be, more relevant, right? But then again, that's also where again I struggle with, if that bar of entry as a 3D artist is so high, um, you know, but I also have interest in technical art, but then some technical art positions need like fluent programming skills, and for me, I'm more interested in the game engine aspects, how I pivot myself between those types of positions, right? Because it sometimes just feels, you know, overwhelming, and and frustrating when I'm having to feel like I have to bottleneck myself to a specific position when I feel like if I apply to other aspects of development that are still relevant to me, especially on the indie side where I am more of a generalist, then, how I, position myself in that regard.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a grind. There's no silver bullet. I'm, Congregate after moving on from ZeniMax, Congregate was the first real like game studio that I was able to work at in like 6 years. It took me 6 years to start getting paid to make games close to the type of games I want to eventually make. Um, you have to, you might have to take jobs that you don't want, and you might have to stay there for a while just to build up your skills or build up your more more realistically, you're building up your network during that time
Hmm.
and your advancement on your portfolio. I never want to work on slot machines again, and I didn't want to keep working on slot machines after a year of doing it. That's where I was for 5 years, and that's where I had to be to get where I am. I try
Mm.
not to give too specific advice because the way I did it isn't necessarily going to work for other people. Everyone's story is different, and I do think it's harder than it was for me when I was like moving up through the industry. And I've just survived 3 rounds of layoffs. If I wouldn't necessarily be having the same conversation if I had been laid off a month ago. I'd be on the job hunt, the grind myself, stressing out about interviews, trying to make sure my resume and portfolio were perfect, and getting, you know, down on myself every time a rejection comes through.
All right, well, this is going to bring us to about time. So thank you, Jacob, for this awesome chat, and thank you, community, for your great questions. Before we leave, I'm going to ask you, Jake, do you have anything that you want to plug?
Sure. Um, if you like CCGs, download Animation Throwdown, give us your feedback, let us know what you think. Tumbleweed Express, it's a game about trains with guns on them in the Wild West. Even you can still get it on Steam. Don't Push Me, it's a 2D that's also on Steam. That's just one of my personal projects. It's something I put together. I bring it to MagFest every year on a cabinet. People seem to like it. And watch the next episode of this a week from now. This has been super fun.
All right, great. And finally, what we like to have all of our guests do is give our listeners some homework. What's one thing that they can do that will really help them on their game development journey?
Yeah, go to find out where they're holding the next local game developer meeting, and make a plan to show up.
That sounds excellent. Find some dev groups, show up, and make some friends. All right, everyone, that wraps us up for today. Thank you for showing up and listening. If you enjoyed it, we ask that you send this podcast along to at least one other
Thank
person
you.
who you think will enjoy it, and come join us for the next one. See you later.